In our last video, I talked about marine velvet and how quickly it killed our new tang from Diver's Den. I hesitated in that video to say where the fish had come from because I don't want to speak badly of them, but I think people have a right to know that it happened. There is absolutely no other source that the velvet would have come from. The fish in that quarantine tank, in fact all of our fish that we had been where they were for 3 months with no other introductions to any tank at all in that time period. It was unfortunate that we trusted the quality of the fish from their site, and as a result we ended up losing hide and seek, our 2 clownfish that were the very first saltwater fish that we ever purchased. We got them nearly 2 years ago when we set up the tank. They were bonded, they were breeding, and they were very beautiful. I wasn't going to post this video at all because though the treatment did help and they did survive for nearly another week, in the end the velvet won. I wondered what the point was of doing a video about a treatment process that hadn't worked, but I know that the odds were already against them. It's a miracle that they lasted even another week, and if there was any chance at all that they could have survived, I had to take it. The process I followed in this video is what is outlined on the Reef to Reef forum article that I referenced in the last video. I read through it repeatedly and I tried to do everything exactly right. I hope that this is helpful to someone else who may find their fish suffering from velvet, and I hope that if there are any experienced viewers out there who have successfully treated and saved a fish with velvet, that they will watch this video and provide feedback about how I could have done it differently. Maybe if we ever have another fish with this disease, we'll be able to save it. I know that I look like a mess in this video, but there was no time to look pretty. I wanted the camera on so that I could watch what I had done and see if I had made any mistakes or if there was something I could do differently. But yeah, there's no time to pretty up here. There were lives at stake. One of the things that was the hardest for me to wrap my head around was the fact that I had to keep essentially 3 or 4 different containers at the same exact water temperature for a very prolonged period of time. The only way that I could figure out how to do that was to put all of the other containers into one larger container that I would use as my temperature control. So in this video you'll see me prepping the one, it looks kind of like a mop bucket in the sink. That is my control container where the heater belongs and some thermometers, and then all of the other buckets that the fish will be in and actually swimming in and being treated in are going to go inside of that. I will say that even though the fish were not going in that bucket, it is a brand new bucket. There's been no chemicals in it. I didn't want to risk any kind of cross-contamination from the water. One of the things that I do want to mention before we get started is the hospital tank. Once you do this treatment, you cannot put your fish back in the tank that had marine velvet. They're going to have to be in a suitable hospital tank for at least 6 weeks while the other tank runs fallow. I'll be working on a separate video for how to set up a hospital tank. In the meantime, this video is going to show you everything that I did to try to treat marine velvet and try to save these fish. There are a couple of different medication options that you can choose from when you are treating marine velvet. We chose to use Ruby Reef Rally for our process. You're also going to need 2 working air stones. One of them goes in the freshwater dip that you will perform, and the other one goes in the medicated container that the fish will be in for about 1 hour and 15 to 1 hour and a half. It is very important to aerate the freshwater dip before they go in, and it's important to continually aerate the water that is in the medicated container. In your temperature control bucket, double check it occasionally and make sure that the water is staying at the correct temperature, because that is what's going to hold the temperature for the other containers that the fish are going to be in for a very long time. Okay, so right here we're almost ready. We've got 2 containers. The tall one is going to have the medication in it. The small one is going to be for the really quick freshwater dip, and you can see the heater and the thermometers that are in the primary bucket that are going to be my temperature control. Alright, so right here is one of the things that I think I need to change if I ever have to do this again. The problem that I ran into was that the measurements on the medication are pretty specific, but the container that they were going into does not have any measurements on it, and I didn't have it completely full of water either. So I was trying to figure out, using the little measurements that are on the freshwater dip container, roughly how much was going to be also in the medicated container. Going forward, I think I need to have a container on hand that has measurements on it that I can know 100% has the right dosage for this treatment. This was really frustrating to try to figure out because I wanted it to be right. There we go. So we have our fish who have been brought over in the specimen container from their copper-treated hospital tank. I have the freshwater dip container that they'll only be in for just a few short minutes. And I've got the medicated container that they'll be in for about an hour and a half. Step 1, perform the freshwater dip for 5 minutes. I did hold the air stone at the very top of the water during this process so that it was barely touching, just as a fail-safe, a little bit of help for them. I set the timer on the microwave and watched them for the entire 5 minutes to see if there were any signs of distress. Once the 5 minutes had expired, it was time to drain as much of the fresh water out of the container as I could and move them into the medicated bucket. Once they were in the medicine, it was now a waiting game. I went with 75 minutes on the timer on the microwave, and from there I wanted to observe them and make sure that they weren't struggling at all, that they weren't needing to come out of the medicine. So I really did sit there and almost focus on these fish entirely for 75 minutes. In case some of you are wondering why there are 2 thermometers in there with the heater, sometimes these really cheap glass thermometers, in fact a lot of thermometers, can be kind of inaccurate. Having 2 thermometers lets you read an average, and it gives you a better chance of keeping an accurate temperature. You want to talk about a weird way to answer people when they say, "How did you spend your Saturday?" I literally watched these fish and monitored them for almost an hour and a half. Talk about a great time. But I was really worried for them. I wanted to make sure that they were okay, and I didn't know if they were even going to make it through this process. Marine velvet is bad enough, and the fish are weak already, and I knew that all of this moving them around and dumping from one container to another, which I really hated, was actually really hard on them. Now, there is one thing that I did do differently from what the article on Reef to Reef said. So I decided that instead of taking them directly from the medication into the copper water, I wanted to rinse them really quick in fresh water again, just to make sure that they didn't bring any of that medicine over into their copper-treated tank. I didn't know what the reaction between those chemicals might be. So a really, really fast rinse off helped, I think, make that transition. I know I kind of got in front of the camera here, but at the end of it all, they finally now have made it back into their copper water that they were brought over with from the hospital tank. So it's still salinity matched, still temperature matched. It's been in this control bucket the entire time. You can see that they held up pretty well. They look like they're fine. They're swimming okay, but the female never really ate from the time that she got her first spots of velvet until the day she died. She lasted for about 6 days from the day that the symptoms were seen, and the male died 24 hours later. So their appetite was definitely diminished, and I don't know what I could have done differently except to maybe start treatment sooner, and maybe I could have done a freshwater dip on them as I took them from the quarantine tank that they were in and put them into their hospital tank. But I know that I need to make some changes for next time. I know that I need some buckets that are a little bit bigger so I don't have to be dumping them from one to the other. It would be nice to have a more gentle way to move them around. And I also need some buckets that have measurements on them so I know exactly the volume of water that's in each of these. If anybody has any feedback on what I could do differently, any tips or tricks or things that you do to help with this process, I would really appreciate it. And thank you again to the people on Reef to Reef forums and to Humblefish specifically for posting this article. I really appreciate it. It gave my fish a fighting chance, even though I know that the odds were stacked against them and they didn't make it. I hope that next time we can be a little bit better prepared. It was really hard to lose these guys, and it looks like our quarantine procedures are going to have to be modified again. No longer will fish from Diver's Den be put into a tank with any other fish. We're just going to have to treat them like every other source that we deal with, unfortunately. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.